This presentation was prepared as part of the HAP 709 course on healthcare databases taught by Professor Alemi at George Mason University, Department of Health Administration and Policy. The slides are created and narrated by Taylor Galownia, a student in the Health Informatics field graduating in 2020. What is a nested query? A nested query is essentially a query within a query. It consists of two codes, the outside code and the inside code. The inside code is considered the nested part of the query. While the inside code can function by itself within its parentheses, the outer code cannot. The inner code can be a select, from, or where statement. In the next 3 slides, we will explore examples of each. This is an example of a nested query within a where statement. Shown in red is the where, with the nested query below in yellow. We often see nested queries within a where statement when we want to make sure the outer code abides by a certain qualification. For instance, in this example, we only want the patient with ID 100. This is an example of a nested query within a from statement. The beginning of the from statement is highlighted in red and the nested query in yellow. In this example, we are naming the location of where we find last visit as B, which is then used in the from statement to complete the outer query. Lastly, we see an example of a nested query within a select statement. The beginning of the select statement is highlighted in red and the nested query in yellow. Similarly to the last slide, we are using the nested query to designate a new column called last visit, created with the max function, which will be selected along with the patient ID and ICD-9 into the table. You may be starting to wonder when it would be appropriate to use a nested query. Let's explore some of the pros and cons. In most circumstances, it is better to not use a nested query. This is because nested queries have slower performance. Nested queries essentially run through the code twice, meaning execution time can be up to twice as long as a non-nested query. So why do we use nested queries at all? Well, if the goal is to make the code more compact with less coding steps and reduced need for temporary files, then a nested query would be your answer. Nested queries can also be helpful when using the set function to calculate a constant that will later be made available within a query. However, it is important to remember that nested queries are generally not recommended. The next several slides will take us through the steps in completing question 2 of the Week 5 individual assignment on nested queries. The question asks that we write a nested query that first finds the last visit by a patient, then reports their diagnoses during that last visit. Let's take a look. For this assignment, I decided to start with the non-nested query first. Here, you see the code of the non-nested query using the cleaned up data from the Week 5 individual assignment. We want to find the latest visit for a patient and the diagnoses that were reported during that visit. I selected ID, max age at diagnoses, as last visit, depicting the latest visit since the patient is the oldest here, and the ICD-9 so that we can see the diagnoses during this visit. The highlighted section is the first step that finds that last visit for a patient, which I chose to use patient with ID 100. Note that we put the columns into a temporary file called inner. You will see in the next few steps why we do this. Highlighted here is the second step of the non-nested query. In this step, we join the temporary file inner with itself to get the results for both the latest visit, which would be the visit where the patient is the oldest, and the diagnoses that were reported during that visit. This slide displays the first 3 rows from the output, as well as the execution time and total number of rows. It took 2 seconds to run this query. Remember this number as we will compare it to the execution time for the nested query in a few slides. Here we see the same code, but formatted as a nested query. The nested query takes the 2 steps from before and meshes them into one. The 2 highlighted sections are the inner code. Remember, the outer code is dependent on the inner nested code. Also note that we no longer use any temporary files, but instead join the table to itself in the bottom highlighted section. Highlighted in this slide is the inner nested query. Here, we nest the query within a from statement. We name this query alias A so that we can later join it with itself as alias B. This nested query is the same code as the first step from the non-nested example. Shown above are results from the nested query execution. It took 4 seconds to run this query, which is double the time of the non-nested query. We'll get the same results, it will just take longer to retrieve them. In conclusion, a simple definition for a nested query is a query inside of another query. Nested queries are more compact and reduce the need for extra coding steps and temporary files. However, they have an execution time almost double that of a non-nested query. It is not recommended to use nested queries due to their lack of efficiency, especially when working with large data sets. This concludes my presentation on nested queries. I hope you enjoyed the content and learned a lot. Thank you.